Why is the Traveler's writing so bizarre? I'm probably going to get a lot of flack for this, but it's something I just want to talk about. I'm saying this from the get-go, you don't have to agree with me, but I am not a fan of the Traveler as a character. It's a personal opinion, but there are a lot of things that make me think that they're not that good of a protagonist. Now, don't get me wrong, they have their moments, but ultimately I think Hoyo could have done a lot better with the Traveler. Again, all of these are personal opinions, you are free to disagree with me. There are a number of problems, but the biggest is that the Traveler, to me, feels very inconsistent, and here's why. The Traveler is the protagonist. Now, several things to establish with them being the protagonist. There's no one exact definition of what a protagonist is, but usually a protagonist is defined as a character that moves the plot forward. They are the one traveling through Tevad and watching different events unfold in each nation that they visit. They are also the one actively pursuing their twin who went missing at the very beginning of the game. The plot moves forward by following the Traveler's journey. Now, the protagonist can be the main character, but they're not always one and the same. The main character is the character that is heavily impacted by the events in the story. They're not always the ones moving the plot forward, but they are vital characters to the story. The examples of a main character in Genshin itself are the Archons, and there can also be multiple main characters, an ensemble, if you will. Each of the Archons are the main characters of their nation's respective Archon quest, but they're not necessarily the protagonist. The Traveler, however, is there as a protagonist. They arrive in a nation and they kick off the events of the Archon quest. I think one of the problems with the Traveler in the early days is that the writers tried to make the Traveler, who is the protagonist, also the main character of the Archon quest and the story quests. This is most apparent in the Inazuma Archon quest, where the Traveler, who moves the plot forward by arriving in a closed-off Inazuma, is also forced with the task of helping the rebellion of the Vision Hunt Decree, but in a way that feels kind of forced. Now, it doesn't feel forced because they were technically forced into it, but it feels forced because I feel like the cast of Inazuma themselves should have played a bigger role as the main characters of the story. But instead, a lot of these characters are just sidelined so the Traveler could have a more important role. They are the ones Ayaka seek to intervene with the Vision Hunt Decree, and they are also the ones made into a captain in the resistance by Kokomi, which I think isn't really necessary to the story at all. The Traveler doesn't need to be a captain or even do much in the Inazuma Archon quest. If the Traveler is supposed to be a witness to the events that are unfolding in Tevat, which we'll get to later, I think in Inazuma especially, them having a role of an important catalyst or just being there to trigger certain events and kick off the plot in order for it to move forward would have been ideal. This way, the Archon quest can give the spotlight to Inazuma characters whose stories are actually impacted by the events happening in Inazuma. For example, Kazuha could have been a great main character in Inazuma. He was heavily impacted by the Vision Hunt Decree. He lost his friend and he fled the country because he refused to give up his vision and took his deceased friend's vision with him. Ayaka and Kokomi were also good main character material that deserves the spotlight or significant amount of screen time for them to be more fleshed out. They all have their own motivations to fight the Vision Hunt Decree, but it's never fully explored because most of the focus is on the Traveler. Ayaka's screen time in the Archon quest is mostly trying to convince the Traveler in helping with the rebellion, and she wasn't even there for most of it. The Traveler had to go around by themselves. Kokomi is pretty similar. The Traveler spends most of the time in Watatsumi Island doing other stuff with Teppei and members of the resistance that are NPCs, but not Kokomi herself. I guess what I'm trying to say is that in Inazuma especially, the writers tried to push the Traveler a bit too much into becoming the main character, to the point that they needed to become a captain for some reason and other random stuff, and doing that kind of felt pointless because it did not add much to the story. They were also supposed to have this very strong bond with Teppei and be impacted story-wise by his death to the point that it would drive the Traveler into rage, and hence why they went to the Delusion Factory in the first place. But because of the rushed execution, it just felt very off, and it felt like the Traveler met, bonded, and lost Teppei in the span of 5 minutes. I personally feel like the Mondstadt and Liyue Archon quest weren't as bad. They had their issues, but like both had their respective Archons and ensemble to fill in the roles of the main character, and the Traveler was for the most part just along for the ride, as they should be. But I think it really improved in Sumeru and Fontaine. I personally think the reason why the Sumeru and Fontaine Archon quests flowed a lot better than their predecessors is because the Traveler had a clear role. In Sumeru, the the Traveler does kick off the chain of events that started the Archon quest, they are the only person that Nahida is able to communicate with and does play a few important roles, but they are, for the most part, are just there to witness things and help the main character. The main character of the Sumeru Archon quest is, of course, an ensemble. Nahida is the main character and is the most impacted by the events surrounding Sumeru because the whole plot is about her getting replaced by a false god. But we also have Alhaitham, Cyno, and to some extent Dihya that are also considered to be the main characters, the ensemble. When the Traveler arrives in Sumeru, this does kick off Alhaitham being told to investigate them. But even then, Alhaitham already has pre-existing suspicions about the academia without the Traveler being in the picture. Cyno also acted independently like way before the Traveler even set foot in Sumeru. This also happened because Dignari, who I would consider a supporting character in the Sumeru Archon quest, grew extremely suspicious about his master's letter. Dihya, while she didn't get the same amount of focus as Alhaitham and Cyno, is still a pretty important member of the main ensemble. She's the one who's connected to the Eremites. Without her, Alhaitham's plan would have never worked. The Traveler is there and they're important, but they are there to either help or play a role tasked by the main cast. They are a vital part to Alhaitham's plan, but they're not necessarily the main hero. He's one of the heroes, but not the only hero. They feel like a natural part of the story that they're supposed to witness. And I think Fontaine did it even better. Similar to Sumeru, Fontaine has a very clear main character, and that is obviously Furina, but it also has a main ensemble that's heavily impacted by the events of the story. There's Nouvellette, Navia, Linny, and Lynette. All of them have their own plot points that eventually converge into the main plot. What does the Traveler do? They're there. They are very important still. They are the ones who defended Linny and Lynette in trial. They progress the story and help it unfold, but they don't overstay their welcome. Even in the moments when they receive the most spotlight, like for example during the trials, the focus was on the Fontaine characters like Linny and then Furina. The Traveler was there because there was no one else to help Linny after he was falsely accused by Furina for murder. That happened because there was an accidental death in his own show that really had nothing to do with the Traveler. The Traveler is really just there to help move the plot forward and help all of the different plot points to converge into one. And it does. The Fontaine Archon quest all relates to Focalors' plan to trick the heavens and destroy the divine throne. With the Traveler helping Linny in the trial, they caught the attention of Navia, who we know is still investigating the truth behind the mysterious death of her father. This then leads the Traveler to uncover the truth behind Navia's father alongside her, a task that she mostly pulled off by herself. Really, again, the Traveler is there and they help, but most of the important plot points are mostly focused on Navia. I think the most focus the Traveler has in the Fontaine Archon quest is when they were in the Fortress of Meropide, which again only happened because it was a request from Nouvellette. And even then, they were mostly running around until they bump into Linny, Lynette, and Fremine on a mission. The Traveler was also unable to trick Wriothesley as he had the upper hand the whole time they were in the fortress. And when the primordial seawater broke out, it was ultimately dealt with by Wriothesley, Chlorine, and Nouvellette. Where was the Traveler? Well, they were accompanying Furina in her meeting with the Knave. Another request given to the Traveler by Nouvellette. Because, you know, Arlecchino isn't the most friendly person that you can meet. The final conflict with the Narwhal was also dealt with by Tartaglia and Nouvellette. The Traveler is definitely there and they definitely helped, but again, he was not the main hero. The people of Fontaine were the main heroes of their own story. Even more so with the reveal that it was all a part of Focalors' plan. It was very clear from the beginning that the Traveler was just there to push the story forward, help it progress, and act as a witness to the events unfolding. There were no moments where they felt like they were forced to steal the spotlight so that they would look cooler or stronger. They were not forced to be impacted by the story and events. They were not forced to be the main character, which is a big reason why I think the stories in Sumeru and Fontaine flowed a lot more naturally than Inazuma. Now that we have established that the Traveler can be a good protagonist but not necessarily a good main character, there's another problem that has bugged me for a very long time. Are they supposed to be their own character or are they a self-insert? I think this is one of the biggest inconsistencies with the Traveler. It's like they're stuck in a limbo. Sometimes they have opinions, but sometimes they just can't speak in moments where it's only natural that they do. Instead, we're usually forced to listen to Paimon speak over them, which we will get to, don't worry. But that's the thing though, we're all okay with the silent protagonists. They're not always bad. Sometimes they work just fine. For example, Link from Breath of the Wild is probably one of the most well-known silent protagonists and people love him. I love him, and it's not just because he's hot, but at least Link in his most recent incarnations, like in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, are presented in a way that they're never in a position that they need to speak. To be fair, there's minimal dialogue in the most recent Zelda games, and even then the games try to explain why Link is so silent. He doesn't like to speak because he doesn't want to burden anyone with the immense weight that he's carrying with being the chosen one. You can argue that it's an easy cop-out on making him silent, but regardless, the intention of Link has always been to be a silent protagonist. He was always supposed to be somewhat blank, to act as an instrument for the players to experience the world of Zelda. This decision has its drawbacks. It can make Link feel like a cabbage during emotional scenes because he doesn't say anything, but because it's a conscious and consistent, keyword consistent decision made by Miyamoto and the devs, I personally think the players are free to insert their own thoughts and hear their own voice as Link, which is the whole point of his character, so it doesn't cause as much problems as it does for the Traveler. It also gives the players a feeling like they are the heroes of the story, which is also completely fine if that is indeed the intention. Sometimes we want to escape our shitty lives and feel like we're contributing to society and saving the princess. There's nothing wrong with that. So it's okay to have a silent and self-insert protagonist as long as it's done consistently. I have seen some people on the internet defend the Traveler by saying that they're not really a self-insert, that they have a clear goal and a set personality from the get-go. It's not the writer's fault that the players view the Traveler as a self-insert when they were never supposed to be one. They're mostly silent because they don't know the language of Tevad very well. The line delivery between Aether and Lumine are different, so even though both are canon protagonists, they're also still two different people with different personalities. And I'm not fully convinced by this. I think for the most part, it's true that the Traveler has a backstory and has canon dialogue without Paimon. Paimon was missing for a lot of important quest moments, and the Traveler can speak and form their own opinions just fine. They have voice lines just like any other character. The Aranyaka journal is written from their point of view, so they, for the most part, actually do have the building blocks of an actual character. But it's not utilized enough to make the Traveler actually feel like one. And again, that's fine. It's fine for the Traveler to be a silent protagonist with a clear backstory and goal and motivation. Silent protagonists have been around in video games for a really long time and they can work. But we have to accept that the drawback of this, as mentioned, is that they will not have an interesting personality. They cannot have any personality, or at least they need to have a very minimal personality. I said personality too many times. They need to be a blank slate, or else it would lead to what I would call a clash between character motivation and player interaction. To me personally, the Traveler sometimes is the silent protagonist, other times they're supposed to have a personality of their own. They have their own thoughts and voice lines and opinions that don't necessarily align with the players, meaning they're not a complete blank slate, and this is where it gets tricky. If the writers can't decide on what kind of protagonist the Traveler is, then there will be inevitable awkward moments where the Traveler's actions and thoughts become annoying to the players because they can't hear their own voice through the Traveler anymore. One of the best examples that I can think of is the way the Traveler treats the Fatui throughout the story so far. Like, yes, they're the antagonists and the main villains in a lot of the quests, but hey, I'm a player and I don't always feel like the Fatui is the comic book villain that the Traveler and Paimon sometimes make them out to be. They can be quite nuanced. Like, the most obvious recent example is Linny and Lynette. They are far from what we would usually call villains. They're not the antagonists either because they haven't really gone against the protagonist. They're not out for blood or to cause any mayhem either. They're simply doing their job, and they are prominent members of the House of the Hearth, part of the Fatui. And the way the Traveler acted towards them can be quite jarring to a lot of players. This caused quite the debate back in the day. In my opinion, the Traveler did their best to defend Linny in a murder trial, and he omitted very crucial information about himself which did not help the situation at all. If you're a bit hazy on the details, when the Traveler tried to exonerate Linny from accusations of a murder that occurred in his own show, there was a vital piece of information about the sound of a vase breaking during the show, which is something that most of the audience, Furina, and the Traveler themselves had heard. Linny, however, did not hear this because he was busy trying to investigate the Oratress. We later learned that the vase breaking was due to a scuffle caused by the true murder, which happened right below the set of Linny's show. Linny was too far away. He was near the Oratress to even hear this happening, but he told everyone, including the Traveler, that he was nearby, that he was just doing his set. Linny did this because he wanted to conceal his identity and ties to the Fatui, because what else could possibly motivate him to mess with the Ortress if not for shady Fatui business? And you gotta admit, as sympathetic as Linny is as a character, this was a pretty dick move considering the Traveler was going out of their way to defend him and his innocence. I can see it that way because I personally don't see the Traveler as a vessel or a self-insert, hence why it's easier for me to try and understand what motivates their actions and what drives certain reactions from them. But some players might experience that scene differently. Some might view the Traveler's actions as rude or lacking in empathy, which is fair because if I were to self-insert my own thoughts, I would not have reacted that badly. I would have been disappointed and annoyed, but I still think the Traveler could have handled it with more compassion than just to brush off Linny as another Fatui goon. But nope, because this Traveler now suddenly has a formed opinion, and that is Fatui bad. Yes, the Fatui has caused a lot of trouble for the Traveler, but you'd think by the time they reach Fontaine, they would have a bit more understanding about how the Fatui has a lot of real people that aren't necessarily pure evil. Like, not even the Harbingers are fully evil, and they know this. They're friendly with Child, and they are able to tolerate the Wanderer. In the very same quest, they can talk to Child in a civil manner. They're distrusting of him, which is understandable, but at this point in the story, the Traveler's opinion about the Fatui should have evolved a little bit, just as some players' opinions on the Fatui has also evolved. Especially considering that there are quests like the one in the chasm where innocent Fatui soldiers were trapped underground. They were just trying to do their job and trying to not die because the entrance to the chasm is suddenly sealed off. This is a problem for me because I saw them as a character with their own motivations because they have strong opinions about certain things, but then on other things they just can't have a reaction or say anything of substance because they have to stay silent. It's inconsistent, and I'm sure for the players who enjoy the Traveler as a self-insert, it can be pretty frustrating when the Traveler suddenly treats Farina in a pretty insensitive manner after the Fontaine Archon quest, and witnessing the suffering that she had to endure for 5 centuries. It can be really jarring because for most of the game, the Traveler has a very lukewarm personality where Paimon does most of the talking, and thus making it easier for players to insert their own thoughts and voice through the Traveler. I personally think the writer should commit and either make the Traveler like Link completely silent and malleable, or they just make them a full fleshed out character. Anything than this weird in between that we have now, where the Traveler's choices doesn't really feel like our own, yet at the same time they don't have the personality to make them feel like a standalone character that naturally has their own opinions. We can't have it both ways, and for another reason too, and that is, it's pretty hard to make an interesting self-insert character. To have a vessel that players can use to self-insert in a video game, if that is indeed the goal, then we will need a character with a lukewarm personality so that they will feel relatable and at least likable. A lukewarm personality doesn't exactly translate into a memorable and compelling character, which if the writers are trying to make the Traveler into a standalone character at the same time, it will inevitably fall flat. I'm gonna use this Reddit post that I found and use Sherlock Holmes to explain. Don't worry, I will be making comparisons with other video game characters later on, but right now I'm just gonna try to make my point using this example. So most of you might know Sherlock Holmes is a very famous detective from a book series called Sherlock Holmes. He's also pretty well known to be kind of an asshole. He's smart but also very arrogant. He's the protagonist and the main character of the story, but he's far from being likable, which is why there's a second main character that's used as more or less the vessel for the audience. His sidekick, Dr. Watson. Watson is nice. He tries to do the right thing. He comments on the things that Sherlock Holmes does, but he doesn't always necessarily agree with them. He's the likable, relatable guy that functions both as a vessel and as a buffer for Sherlock Holmes' strong yet interesting personality. Most video games don't have a Watson, or they just make one hell of a main character with fully fleshed out character arcs that may not be 100% relatable to the players, but when done right, they will serve a pretty damn good narrative. Now, I'm not saying Genshin as a gacha game should have the same level of protagonist writing like Joel or any other story-driven game, which is why I'm gonna compare it to Honkai Star Rail. Now, I actually don't like making comparisons between these two games because I think they're both enjoyable in their own way, but I think in this case, it's fair. I personally think it's fair to say that the Trailblazer is at least more interesting in terms of personality than the Traveler. Disclaimer, I don't play as much as Honkai Star Rail as I have played Genshin. I have played a good chunk of the main quest to be at least somewhat familiar with the Trailblazer's personality. The Trailblazer's dialogue option in Star Rail, even in the early days, which is when I played the game the most, was already really different from the Traveler's. It already has a lot more personality. Sometimes it's witty, sometimes it makes no goddamn sense, but it's through dialogue like these that the Trailblazer feels like a character. In comparison, the Traveler's dialogue options are mostly that one sentence split into two, and that sentence usually doesn't have any narrative weight anyway. It's not even a real dialogue. Most of the time, it's just something that Paimon will repeat 2 seconds later. It's mostly there as a poor attempt to create the illusion of choice. Not only does this make the Traveler feel like a boring character with nothing to say most of the time, repeating the same thing over and over again will get annoying after a while. The Trailblazer also has March 7th and Dan Heng, who are interesting and fleshed out characters on their own as their companion. It lets the Trailblazer's personality and their companions' personalities bounce off each other pretty well. It creates this believable friend group dynamic that's fun to follow instead of it just being another moment where the Traveler teases Paimon for being a glutton for the 700th time. The Traveler can be interesting just in the moments where they actually feel like a standalone character, and that to me shines the most in the Dainsleif quests. Here they are usually free to talk and usually without Paimon intervening too much. Like in We Will Be Reunited, there is that scene where the Traveler actually surprised Paimon and the players about their knowledge of Khaenri'ah. That is one of the moments that convinced me that the Traveler is not just a blank slate. They're a character that's treated like a blank slate because it's just easier to sell in a gacha game with a self-insert and silent protagonist, which is what I think is the underlying problem here and why the Traveler feels so inconsistent as a character. They are interesting in concept, but they can't be too interesting or else they might not be relatable anymore, and when the cute girls and the cute boys are nice to the Traveler, it doesn't have the same impact anymore. And that might impact character sales, maybe, I don't know, that's just how I feel sometimes. Now, if you tell me that the Traveler has amazing lore and is hiding a ton of stuff because they have no reason to talk about them, I would believe you, because I'm sure they do. But like, can the writers show that in the quests, where he's the protagonist of the quests? It's very hard to be interested in a character's hidden lore if most of the player base will forget about said lore even existing because it's never shown or even mentioned in the game itself, or at least during the main quest. This is a big problem for a lot of the characters in Genshin. Like, a lot of these characters have really interesting backstories that's hidden behind a wall of text, and that side of the character is barely shown on screen. And I know, like, we can just not be illiterate and read, but this, at the end of the day, is a video game. You can't tell me that reading a wall of text is acceptable when the medium that Genshin is on can actually show you these events and conversations happening on screen during quests. Yes, I know they can't do all that for all of the characters. Like, I don't expect them to do this for Dory, but this is the protagonist we're talking about, so I think expecting a little special treatment for them is justified. The Paimon problem. Now, this topic actually deserves its own video. I don't know, tell me if you want a Paimon video. But I'm gonna touch a bit on how I think the existence of Paimon kinda doomed the Traveler into this limbo. Paimon exists as a crutch to the Traveler. She has to repeat everything that's said to the Traveler and will talk in the place of the Traveler too. It also doesn't help that Paimon doesn't have the best personality either. It has gotten better over the years, but in the earlier days, like in Mondstadt to Inazuma, she was basically a money-hungry glutton. That's it, and every line delivery is the same. No matter the context or nuance of the situation, it's the same delivery, same reaction. Don't get me wrong, Paimon does have her moments. She can be a very sweet companion, and Genshin would not feel like Genshin without her. But you can't really deny that she takes away so much from the Traveler. Yes, we're made to believe that what she's saying is also what the Traveler is saying, but I would much rather hear the Traveler say it themselves. Like, one of the most enjoyable quests in my opinion is Kari Bear. It's the quest where the Traveler falls asleep and wakes up without Paimon. Yes, it turns out they were having a vision from their twins' point of view, but that's not revealed until the end of the quest. And throughout the quest, it was just nice to see the Traveler interacting with another character, even if it's just an NPC. And Ido was a pretty damn solid NPC if I say so myself. It's nice to see how the Traveler can react to bizarre situations without Paimon screeching in their place. It was also personally very enjoyable to me that Paimon was not there to regurgitate everything that's happening on screen. It makes the Traveler feel like a character, and their dialogue also feel a lot more concise. Paimon's line delivery can also sometimes come off as insensitive because she is just brash in nature. Like, even in situations where it's very clear that it's an emotional moment where another character is being vulnerable to the traveler, but because Paimon is there, she just says shit like this. It can get really annoying after a while, and I think if the traveler is ever going to go down the fleshed out character route, they will need to snatch some of that dialogue away from Paimon. Like that scene between the traveler and their sibling at the end of Bedtime Story is also one of my favorite ones, because it just feels like a genuine interaction and conversation between two characters. What frustrates me is that the traveler and Paimon can actually have a good dynamic, as seen in the traveler's own voice lines. They banter in these voice lines and it's actually quite entertaining. But for some reason, because the writers seem to want the traveler to be silent enough to also be the silent protagonist, none of this is shown in the actual quests. Or if they are shown, it's very minimal, like the bar is set in hell. Paimon usually talks over the traveler instead of adding things to the conversation, and another problem that Paimon creates, because she has to simplify things and speak in the traveler's place, a lot of nuance that the traveler might have is just gone. Paimon will say stuff like how the Fatui are the bad guys, which in some cases they are, but she says this in Fontaine. We've progressed enough through the story to know that there's a lot more nuance when it comes to the Fatui as an organization, but because Paimon needs to simplify everything, this gives off the impression that the Fatui is no different than Team Rocket. Because she needs to be goofy, she can come off as insensitive, and this in turn can rob the traveler of an emotional bonding moment with a lot of characters. The only silver lining that I can think of from having Paimon talk over the traveler 90% of the time is how most of the player base lose their minds every time the traveler opens their mouth. Especially in the early days, it was hilarious. Like that one sentence about putting up posters at the end of the Liyue Archon quest, and another one was when the traveler was trying to find Nahida and they just started frantically screaming Nahida, and everyone was just so excited about that. It does create memorable moments for the player base, I'll give you that. In this section, I will admit the things I will say will probably sound like a lot of nitpicking, but these are just some of the thoughts that I've accumulated over the 4 years of playing this goddamn game, and I want to talk about them regardless. The more I talk about this, the more I wonder, does anyone like Silent Traveler? Not a silent protagonist, because we know a lot of people love silent protagonists, like hey, I love Link, I love the Trailblazer, the Persona protagonists are also silent and they all work just fine. But does anyone actually like Silent Traveler? If you do, please let me know why in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious. Like, there's obviously nothing wrong with liking the Traveler being a silent protagonist, but I personally just enjoyed the Traveler as a standalone character. I would love for them to be more fleshed out and develop and be given actual speaking roles and significant dialogues in Archon quests. The only quests that I see the Traveler shine in these aspects are again the Dainsleif quest, where here the focus is to move the main plot forward. It's to uncover the motivations of the main antagonist, the Abyss Twin, and by doing that, we also learn more about the Traveler. And this is why I love these quests a lot too, because they make the Traveler a more interesting character to me. With every piece of information that we learn about them, they slowly start to feel like a real person and a real character. I personally think silent protagonists like Link work pretty well because the story of The Legend of Zelda is never really that complicated. Yes, there's a lot of lore behind the world, but the story has never been the backbone of the Zelda games. And for the Trailblazer, while they are silent for the most part, the absence of Paimon and having actual dialogue options actually work in their favor pretty well. They feel like they have this canon chaotic personality regardless of what option you pick. Dan Heng and March 7th also help by reacting to and bantering with the Trailblazer rather than speaking over them. Other than the inconsistencies in personality and opinions, I personally think the Traveler also suffers from inconsistencies in morality. Now, I'm going to exclude things like them killing hilichurls, but where they stand and how they tolerate certain characters has been a bit all over the place. They have a very strong dislike towards the Fatui, and yes, again, the Fatui has given the Traveler a hard time throughout the story, and this leads them to having an extreme reaction towards anyone tied to the organization. I'm not saying this is unjustified, like as mentioned, it's understandable why they would be pissed off at Linny and Distrusting Child, and why they would be so angry at Scaramouche. The one that I still have a problem with is how they treated A, and how there was really no buffer time for the Traveler to process all of A's actions in the Inazuma Archon quest. If you say the Balladeer tried to kill the Traveler, which made the Traveler very wary of him, then that's true, that's justified and completely understandable. But the Raiden Shogun puppet tried to kill the Traveler multiple times, and I've seen the argument that the puppet was on autopilot and A had nothing to do with it, which is why the Traveler didn't give her a hard time after the Archon quest. Which is, in my opinion, kind of BS. this. Like, A knew what the puppet was doing the whole time. She knew about the Traveler and the Vision Hunt decree and the harm that it was causing to her own nation. And yet the Traveler was able to be okay with all of that after one conversation at the end of the Archon quest. Now, to give them credit, the way the writers handled the development between the Balladeer and the Traveler was a lot better. They at least gave an entire interlude quest dedicated to show the complexities that the Wanderer has as a character. Both the players and the Traveler are actually given the chance to sympathize with him after learning his backstory and what made him so terrible in the first place. Hence, the interactions between the Traveler and the Wanderer has always felt a lot more believable than what happened with A. It also helps that Nahida is there to act as a buffer in these situations. And I do think the way the Traveler is reacting to complex characters and complex situations is handled a lot better in recent days. Another thing that's never really made clear about the Traveler is how strong are they actually. I think the most common belief about the Traveler is that they are very strong. Like at the beginning of the game, before they ran into the unknown god and stuff, like they had their full power, they were super strong, but then it was sealed off. So I'm not gonna talk about that. I'm gonna talk about the Traveler post unknown god, and I'm not gonna debate how strong they actually are in theory. I'm mostly mentioning this because since it's never established how strong they are post unknown god, it can cause a bit of confusion. The Traveler can sometimes pull shit like this and then it's never explained where that came from. I think setting a bit of expectations for the players on what the actual power scaling is would make the Traveler's powers and their development a lot more interesting to follow. If they are slowly regaining their combat abilities through the use of the elements, it would have been interesting if they had shown the Traveler slowly regaining said power, like showing how their power is slowly coming back, or master new abilities that are completely different from their original power while in Teyvat. Something, I don't know. Like Link was stripped of his power at the beginning of Breath of the Wild, and throughout the story, as he explored more of Hyrule, he starts to regain his power back. I guess for the Traveler, them getting access to new elements should have the same weight as unlocking a new set of power, but so little importance is put on it, and because most of the time the new abilities that they gained is also not very good gameplay wise, it's usually just forgotten. It goes pretty much that statue, glow a different color, and that's it. That aside, I actually like the Traveler is not unbeatable. I also talked to my best friend about this, and he said he also really likes how the Traveler pretty much needs the help of other people in the Seven Nations to actually solve the crisis. Like, he would actually need the help of the Archons most of the time. Like how in Mondstadt it was with the help of Ventie, and in Liyue with the Chiseng and the Adepti. In Inazuma it's through the vision and ambition of the people, and in Sumeru it's Nahida's Samsara loop, and in Fontaine it's Neuvillette. It just gets a bit weird when the game panders to the players by saying that the Traveler is the hero of these nations, when, well, technically they helped, but it was a collaborative effort at the end of the day. I also really like that they were clearly no match for the Knave. Even with the help of the children, the Knave still pretty much sat the Traveler down. We already know that the Traveler is strong enough to defeat Signora and Child in one-on-one combat, but they are definitely not strong enough to defeat the rest of the Harbingers, which is again something that I really like. I hope that Hoyo can explore more of how the Traveler can gain more power and become stronger without making it seem like he's too overpowered or something that's pulled out of their asses. Like, I personally would love to see a proper training arc where there's clear progression in their power. So they're a witness, right? This is more or less the same complaint about how Hoyo can't seem to decide if they want to make the Traveler the main character in every quest or if they're just a witness for all of the things that's happening in Teyvat. So if you've made it this far, I'm assuming that we all know that the Traveler is a descender. They're not from the world of Teyvat, so the rules of Teyvat doesn't apply to them. They aren't bound to the heavenly principles the same way the Archons are, and they are also immune to erosion. All of the Archons, as powerful as they are, and every being in Teyvat, are bound to erode. Symptoms of erosion include losing one's consciousness and sense of self, and another one is memory loss. The prime example of this is obviously Aishtaha, and even like the events that affect Irminsul don't affect the Traveler. When Rukkhadevata and later on Scaramouche tries to erase themselves from existence, the Traveler is the only one not affected by this, so no amount of rewriting history will actually work on the Traveler. Hence, the Traveler is immune from memory loss and everything else that comes with erosion. They are the perfect witness, as said so by Zhongli in his first story quest. None of the Seven Nations can be wiped from existence by the heavenly principles because the Traveler is witnessing everything that's happening happening throughout their journey, which in itself is actually an interesting premise for a protagonist. And credit where credit's due, I think Hoyo has written the traveler as a witness pretty well in Sumeru and Fontaine. In Sumeru, they are there to witness a god being freed from her cage and then proceed to watch her predecessor erase herself and watch everyone in that world forget that she even existed, even though Rukadevata was such a big part of Tevat's history. They played a big role in freeing Nahida, but most of the credits are to her believers, that being the people of Sumeru. In every role that the traveler plays in Sumeru, he does so in order to help the main characters of the story and not to take away the spotlight from them. Fontaine did an even better job. As we've already discussed, the traveler is there to witness Focalors' plan unfold and watch the divine throne be destroyed. And I hope that in future Archon quests they will continue with this direction, because this way they truly feel like a witness. Most of these events would have happened one way or another, with or without the traveler. They're there as a catalyst and of course as a witness. I think this works because the Sumeru and Fontaine Archon quest plots were designed around their respective casts. Like in Sumeru, the designated strategist is Alhaitham and the traveler is there to be a part of the plan. And later on during the final fight against Karamush, the traveler also plays a very important role by being the person that was actually fighting the robot and helping Nahida. It gives the traveler a lot of cool and important moments that he deserves as a protagonist, but there's also still a lot of room for the other characters, both main and supporting, to shine on their own. And when they do, the traveler gets to act as a witness to these moments. With all of my nitpicking and complaints about how the traveler should only be a protagonist that acts like a witness, what then is the optimal solution? I think the traveler can actually be the main character in the Dainsleif quests. I've recently made an entire video about those quests, and to sum up, the traveler can be a great protagonist and main character mostly because the quests themselves focus on the traveler, the Abyss Twin, Dainsleif, and Conria, and pretty much nothing else. The main mystery and the plot actually adds a lot to the traveler as a character by revealing bits and pieces about their past. It's also in these quests that the absence of paimon often feels a lot more natural. I personally think that the traveler feels most like their own character and a main character in Caribert because 1, the story's plot actually revolves around them and their sibling, with it being related to Conria. 2, we are shown glimpses into their inner dialogue which can actually build a personality for them. 3, they're allowed to carry concise conversations with other characters that actually builds interesting relationship dynamics. And 4, it's just overall an interesting experience to witness on screen. Hoyo doesn't have to apply this kind of approach for the traveler for every single quest. I think the traveler works just fine as a witness in the Archon quest, world quest, and event quest, and character quests. The Archon quests are about the Archons and their relationship with the people of their respective nations. It's not supposed to have the traveler as the main character. They're there to observe and record the events that transpire in their memories, because as we've discussed, history can quite literally be rewritten in the world of Tevat. The world quests are there to add even more layers into the world of Tevat, things that might not necessarily fit into the Archon quest. Like for example, the Aranara and the Sakura cleansing quest are really engaging quest lines that would not fit into the Archon quest at all because it had nothing to do with the Archons. But having the traveler witness these events is also just as significant and is actually an interesting experience. Like as a player, I think this is the case where the traveler being the silent protagonist can actually kind of work. Since it is a world quest, the traveler will have to interact with the environment more than anything, so being a silent protagonist is really not much of a problem. Paimon still talks over them in the world quest, but I think because it's not voiced and there's less expectation for the traveler to actually have a conversation or react to the characters the same way that they do in the Archon quests, it's slightly more tolerable and enjoyable. Would I still prefer the traveler to actually do the talking? Of course. But because during the world quests, the traveler plays a much more passive lore, aka a witness, and the bread and butter of these quests are the world building lore, it's not as annoying to not see them talk. It becomes a less than ideal experience in the character story quests, at least in my opinion, because well, the featured character kinda needs the traveler to talk to because no one else is there. And because they're silent, it it becomes a conversation between the featured 5-star and Paimon. So there's not really a dynamic being formed here. I'm trying to think of a character story quest where the traveler actually feels like a character and not an extension of Paimon, but I can't. And for the most part, if the featured character can carry their own story quest, it's still a pretty enjoyable experience. Like, they are, after all, the main character of their own story quest, as they should be. And for the most part, like in story quests that does a lot for the character, like there's development in lore and the character themselves. Like, for example, a second story quest, the traveler not doing much or not talking much is fine. Like, they can play the silent protagonist and supporting role, and it would not take away from the experience. It gets kind of weird in story quests that have a lot of moments that rely on relationship dynamics between the traveler and the featured character. Like, for example, in Ayaka and Kokomi's story quest, it will fall flat because there won't ever be a dynamic if the traveler isn't speaking or if Paimon is speaking for them. So then what is my conclusion about the traveler? My conclusion is that they are stuck in this weird limbo of being a silent protagonist, a self-insert, a standalone character, a main character, and a witness. They don't speak like a silent protagonist would, but they also have moments where they are treated like a self-insert when the game presents the illusion of choice to the players, and where they are also forced to be the main character where it doesn't really fit them. With all of these things combined is what I think makes them so bizarre and why people can't seem to agree on what kind of character or protagonist the traveler is, because they show at least one or two traits of all of these tropes. And while the silent protagonist portrayal of the traveler can work in some parts of the story, other times it falls flat. The same can obviously be said if they were a fully fleshed out character and have too much agency that it causes conflict between the players and resulting in the traveler being completely unrelatable. But yeah, I personally think if Hoyo can utilize these different sides of the traveler and play into where each trope can actually add to the story that plays out in these quests, like they can be silent in stories that are more focused on the lore, like in the world quests, and just talk and show off their existing personality more if the story demands them during Archon quests, it would feel like the traveler is a more cohesive character. I think that's all I have to say about the traveler. I obviously don't hate the character, nor am I the most invested in them personally, but considering they are the protagonist, I hope Hoyo can continue to improve on them to make their presence more engaging for the players. If you made it this far and seeing I've already wasted I don't know how many minutes of your life, then consider subscribing. If not, that's also fine. Thank you for watching anyways. That's it for now, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!